Hello and welcome to the next of the on the road video clips. In this clip I'm in the northeastern suburbs. I start off in the northeastern suburbs of Launceston, going through Allenvale, Newnham, Mayfield and then Rochelle. I thought it was pronounced broccoli, but I saw talking to some ladies in a cafe the other day and they told me it's pronounced Rochelle, so I want to make sure I pronounce it the right way and don't sound like I'm not a local, which I'm. So it's pronounced Rochelle, and that is a suburb that's kind of on the Lilydale Road, Lilydale being a village about 30 odd kilometres from Launceston, where there's a great set of falls to go and have a look at. I'd gone up there particularly because there's a running track called the Rochelle Rail Trail that runs the trail runs along beside the railway line, and I have run it a couple of times when I was last here, but I forgot exactly where it came out. So I went up there to find out, to make sure I could recognise the road that it came out onto and which way I had to turn. So that's where I am, and then when I'd found that place I turned around and went back down the same way towards through Mayfield, Newnham, Allenvale, and then down towards the city. And at the end of this video you'll see what constitutes a traffic jam in Launceston on a Sunday afternoon. I'm not sure what was happening on that Sunday, but there seemed to be an awful lot of traffic going into town, and I could have edited all that out, but I thought I'd leave it in and let you see what happened during that part of the ride. Alright, so that's the context of where I was going and what I was doing. I thought what I would do today, what I want to talk about, was standards, and I'll get straight into it. When I was working, I worked in education as a school teacher for 38 years, and in schools we have standards. We have standards for dress, for example. We say that children should wear a uniform and they should wear it and it should be clean and neat and tidy and so on. And a boss that I used to work for at one stage explained it to me this way. She said to me, well, in the mornings when I get up and go to the gym, I put on my gym clothes and I do my workout and whatever. And then I come back and I shower and I change and I put on my work clothes, and I'm in a frame of mind for going to work and doing the things I need to do when I get to work. The idea of children putting on their school uniform is that they're going to a place to learn. So they put on their learning clothes and they're not going to visit their friends. And so that's the standard. We have a standard for dress. We have a standard for what we expect in terms of behaviour, and although each school has variations on the same rules, they're all pretty much the same. Be where you're supposed to be when you're supposed to be there. Be polite. Raise your hand when you want to talk. Listen to your teachers. Don't get into fights with other people, those kind of things. So there's a standard for behaviour. There's a standard for dress. There's a standard for performance. We say that children at a certain age should be able to do certain things. For example, at a certain age we say they should be able to read a text of this or that level. We say that they should be able to write a piece of text of a certain length that's correctly spelled and has correct punctuation and so on. So there are standards in schools. There are standards in medical care, and they've changed and improved over the years. We've learned more about the human bodies, we've learned more about science as we've got better drugs and so on. We've learned a lot about medical health care, and can you imagine a time when people didn't think that between treating patients, for example, it was a good idea to wash your hands. And over the course of this pandemic, we've all learned a lot about hand sanitisation and wearing masks and so on. So standards in medical care have changed. We have standards in public life, in the sense of saying we expect certain types of behaviour from our elected officials. We expect honesty and integrity and ethical behaviour and so on. And up until the 1990s, almost no Australian states or territories had a corruption commission. Now all of them do, because temptations are great and we need to assist politicians to resist those temptations and investigate when we think they've given into those temptations. So we have standards in that sort of life as well. We have standards that we talk about and think about in terms of how we understand and respond to various acts and things, people and the things that they've done. Now, to give you an example of what I mean by that is, back in 2020, it was the 150th anniversary of Captain Cook's landing on the east coast of Australia. And at the time, there was a lot of agitation from people that they wanted any statue that there was anywhere in Australia of Captain Cook to be taken down. They wanted anything that was named after Captain Cook or named after James Cook to be renamed. They wanted him stricken from the history books. And their reasons for that were, well, he came to Australia and he claimed the land for the King of England. Yes, we know he did that, and we know by modern standards it was wrong. He claimed that there was nobody here, and even if there were people here, they weren't using the land, so it was okay for someone else to come along and say, well, I'll just take it. And that's what he did. And we know that was a wrong. And the High Court of Australia has acknowledged that wrong and said the whole notion of terra nullius, or empty land, was a legal falsehood. And we've recognised it by giving land rights to Aboriginal or Indigenous or First Nations people. Doing that doesn't take away from the fact that James Cook did in fact claim the land for a foreign power without consulting the people who were already here. But James Cook, as well as having done that thing, was a great maritime explorer. He undertook, I think, during his life, 3 major sea voyages. And during those sea voyages, he made wonderful, detailed, accurate maps that helped other seafarers and navigators and sailors to find their way around the oceans for probably decades, if not years, centuries to come. Well, certainly decades to come. So on that basis, should we at least acknowledge that, yes, he did a bad thing, he did a thing that was wrong, but do we want to completely erase him from history and say this man never lived and he never did anything and ignore those achievements? Now, I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm simply making that point of saying there's a standard we have now, and the standard says he did this awful thing, and by that claim of doing an awful thing and claiming land he wasn't entitled to, for the King of England, not for himself, by the way, but for the King of England, he ought to be erased from the history books. Now, this idea of standards applies in all sorts of things, and especially in the entertainment industry, and that's what I want to really talk about a little bit today. And what got me thinking about this was that I spend a bit of time on Facebook. Yes, I know it's a time waster. I don't get my news from there, but I do get some sort of other things that I'm interested in. And one of the things that keeps coming to me is a group called the Turner Classic Movies Group. I don't belong to it, but they keep sending posts and I look at them. And recently somebody sent a post about a particular Western that they thought was a great Western and everybody should watch it. But before they watched it, they needed to put aside their sensibilities about misogyny and sexism and all those other buzzwords that we say now that movies shouldn't ever display, and just enjoy the movie. And it got me thinking about the idea of standards and thinking about, well, this was a movie that was made in the 50s, and you can probably imagine, if you've watched any Westerns, it was one of those stories of, I don't know if I've seen this particular Western, but I mean, they were all very similar in the sense of there was a bunch of wagons heading west, and the brave men who led the wagon conquered the wilderness, fought the Indians when they needed to, built a new town and lived happily ever after. The hero did what the hero did, and at the end of the movie he got the girl because he did the heroic deed, and so on. The truth about that is that most of that was mythology made up by Hollywood movie producers, but nevertheless, in the time that those movies were made, there were a notion that women were the fairer sex and they had to be protected and they couldn't defend themselves and all that sort of stuff that we now wouldn't think of including in our movies. But at the time, that was the standard, that was the movie, that was how life was presented. And if we and so it got me thinking about the idea of, as I say, standards, and it occurred to me that when movies were first being made, there was pretty well open slather. People could make movies about whatever they wanted and they could show whatever they wanted to show in a movie. And then during the 1920s in America, states became very concerned about the sorts of things they were seeing, that people were seeing on movie screens. And I, in doing a bit of research for this, came across the idea that within the space of a few years, 22 states had passed something like 100 laws to do with what could and couldn't be shown in movies. And the movie studio executives thought, if we don't do something about this shortly, we're not going to be able to make movies, or if we make them, they'll be shown in one state and not the other state, and we'll never make any money out of them. So they got a bloke named William Hayes, who was formerly a Methodist minister and had also been the Postmaster General in a presidential administration, and asked him if he would come up with a code for the movies, a self-censorship code. And so he did that, And all the movie producers decided they would adopt this code, and they convinced the state governments and the national and the federal government in America that there would be this code that would apply to the production of movies, and things would not be allowed. And on that basis, they proceeded. And this code existed from the late 1920s all the way through to the early 60s, when, as Bob Dylan would tell you, the times they were a-changing and people's tastes changed, and directors came along and said, well, why can't I do this? Or I'm going to do it and see what happens, and so on. So the code said things like, for example, nudity couldn't be shown. Men and women couldn't be shown sleeping in the same bed. Bad guys were not allowed to win. Criminal behaviour was never to be glamorised, and bad guys were not allowed to win. And a bunch of other things, including religion was not to be mocked, and members of the clergy were not to be made fun of. Now, in the mid to late 30s, one of what is regarded by many film critics as one of the greatest films ever made was made, and it almost didn't get distributed to cinemas because of this particular code. That film was Gone with the Wind, and the reason it almost didn't get publicly released wasn't to do with slavery or violence or war or Clark Gable, who was the main lead, having his way with one of the women, but it was because of a line that he uttered at the end of that movie. At the end of the movie, in the very last scene, the very last line he said, after being asked, something was said to him by Scarlett O'Hara, played by Vivian Leigh. She was the main female lead, and she said something to him, and his answer was, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." And the fact that the word damn was used in this movie was almost enough to say it's in violation of the code and it would not be shown. Somehow they worked their way around it. I don't quite know how, but I suppose common sense prevailed, and the people in charge of the code said, well, it's a 3.5 hour movie, or however long it took to watch the movie, and if they got to that far and the word damn stirred them up, they'd be okay because they were going out of the cinema and they'd get over it. Or I'm not exactly sure what happened, but certainly the movie was released to cinemas, won all sorts of awards, Best Directors and Academy Awards and so on and so forth. Let me fast forward a couple of century or so to the 20-somethings, I think it was this decade, when a film, The Wolf of Wall Street, was released. I don't remember the exact year, but it was within the last 3 or 4 years it was released. It was made by Martin Scorsese, however you pronounce his name. He's thought by some to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest director in American cinema. And in this film, the F word, you know the one I mean, the one that I shan't say because children might be watching these videos, but the F word was said something like 750 times. So there's an example of how our standards have changed. Now, it got me thinking that bit about, I wonder what Shakespeare would have been like if, instead of Julius Caesar turning to Brutus after he'd stabbed him in the back and saying, "Et tu, Brute," which means "you too, Brutus," he'd said the F word, "you too, Brutus." I suspect a lot of children wouldn't have had to sit through Shakespeare, but wouldn't it have been a shame if, for that wonderful language that he used to tell those stories and to write those plays, was substituted by the profanities that seem to permeate television and movies at the moment? Again, my point here is this is how standards have changed. Now, we think we know how to make good TV and good movies now, and we say that a standard is that there should be authenticity. So if we're making a film about Asian people, then there should be Asian people in it. Now, I'm not slumping all Asians together, but I understand there are lots of different Asian groups, Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, and so on. But we would not now think of putting a white person and just doing some makeup on them, try to pass them off as an Asian person. We would not put a white person in blackface and pass them off as Othello. So we say there should be authenticity. There should be representations of all sorts of abilities, from those who are fully able to those who are less fully abled. There should be representations of all sorts of gender and gender diverse people, even sometimes when the story doesn't necessarily call for it, but just so that we've covered all our bases. So we have to have straight people and queer people and all the other permutations in between. Now, I'm not arguing one way or the other about those things. I'm just saying those are the standards that we have at the moment. But who's to say that those are the right standards? As I've just said, standards change over time. We've gone from "I don't give a damn" to 750 times the F word is used, and one movie is almost banned for it, the other one is awarded all sorts of accolades for